Welcome back to Hugging the Cactus, a Mel Gibson podcast. And today we set sail on the Bounty. The Mutiny of the Bounty, filmed at least 5 times, a famous play, a big Hollywood success story. It was inevitable that a definitive version of this story would ultimately be filmed. Originally written by Richard Howe, the book was called Captain Bligh and Mr. Christian. Now, this is all based on an original actual mutiny that was perpetrated in the British Navy, a very famous mutiny that changed a lot of things. However, as many books have been written on the subject, one tends to think of the medium of the motion picture, this odd form of entertainment, as the definitive retelling of history, because you can show it with moving pictures and actors. Today we do that with Mel Gibson. As I said, the book was written by Richard Howe, but the actual screenplay was written by Robert Bolt. Robert Bolt is the screenplay writer for Laurence of Arabia, the writer for Dr. Zhivago, and he also wrote a similar kind of screenplay, which is called The Mission, if you've seen that movie with Robert De Niro. Now, MGM produced this film in the guise of Bernard Williams with Dino De Laurentiis, of all people. This movie was ultimately directed by Roger Donaldson, who we know from No Way Out with Kevin Costner, Cocktail with Tom Cruise, and Species. The soundtrack was done by Vangelis. The cinematography was provided by Arthur Ibbetson, who also did that for Inspector Clouseau, the entire series, Where Eagles Dare, and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. The budget for this film ultimately came down to about 20 million, and they raked in 18.3 worldwide, which you could argue they broke even. This movie, of course, stars Mel Gibson as Master Mate Fletcher Christian. It stars Anthony Hopkins as Lieutenant Bligh. Daniel Day-Lewis is in this film as Sailing Master John Fryer. Liam Neeson makes an appearance as Seaman Charles Churchill. And Laurence Olivier shows up as Admiral Hood. Then, of course, there's Bernard Hill, the captain of the Titanic, and also King Theoden in Lord of the Rings. And there's Edward Fox as Captain Greetham. This movie was in developmental hell for close to a decade. This isn't a remake of the original, the 1935 classic with Clark Gable. It's also not a remake of the 1962 film with Marlon Brando. In fact, 5 of these things were made. We'll get to that in a second. Developmental hell. It gave Robert Bolt a heart attack. The original director attached to the project, David Lean, left. They had a 2-picture concept for this film. Only one part was made, partially due to the heart attack of Robert Bolt, partially due to severe over-budgeting. They just couldn't afford to do this. They couldn't afford to do both. So originally, the 2-part would have been The Lawbreakers, which would have been The Mutiny, and then The Long Arm, which would have been the chase after the mutineers. Principal photography was supposed to start in 1978, but because of, as I said, spiraling budgets, I mean, it would have cost 40 million, an astronomical sum no one would have paid for in 1978. They ultimately pulled out. Dino De Laurentiis didn't have the money. So this film just sort of drifted along. By 1981, the replica they had built of the Bounty was for sale. And Finally, Dino stepped in because he had so much money sunk into this project. He was determined to recoup some of it, and he brought in director Ronald Donaldson to save the movie. The original actor attached to the film to play Fletcher was Christopher Reeve. He dropped out at the last minute and would be replaced by Mel Gibson, who was set to shoot The Night of the Running Man. But that was cancelled, so he was without a project. So he ended up in this. Typically, filming with the Bounty was a nightmare because most of the actors weren't exactly sailors. Shooting a movie on an actual ship is very problematic, as anyone who has seen the making of Jaws will know. People get seasick, real waves really mess up a shot. Lighting changes at the drop of a hat. It's a mess. So was this principal photography. It took way longer than it was supposed to for similar reasons. And of course, they had a ton of bad weather and bad luck. And then there was the occasional, we can't shoot with Mel because his face is all swollen, because he would get drunk and get into bar fights. This is not a joke, this is real. He was a raging alcoholic at the time, and this really hindered his career. Ultimately, he cleaned up, but let's face it, that took a few decades. The second replica ship built for the Pandora was ultimately used in Master and Commander with Russell Crowe, if you want to see it. Hopkins was a problem during the shoot. That was for two reasons. He was insufferable because he's a method actor, and the character he played is an insufferable person. And he just wasn't happy. And he wasn't happy probably with the script. He'd been attached to this film since 1975. He'd been waiting, 8.5 years to shoot it. He was heavily invested, and he wasn't having any of it. Filming in Tahiti is hard anyway. Apparently, director Roger Donaldson is a pretty hard taskmaster, tempers with flair, and they would get into it a lot. So you can imagine what kind of film this made. Hopkins later said of the film that he felt it was a sad mess. He felt it was botched. He basically said that it was a turning point in his career, stating that what he learned from it was not to care too much about projects. Well, that's probably a good idea. If it's not your project, you're just playing in the project, then it's not your project. So being too heavily emotionally invested does not make for a good colleague. Mel Gibson would later comment that he felt that his character should have been the real villain instead of Bligh, but the other four movies dealt with, and most of the books deal with Bligh as a villainous person. But as we shall see, when the plot devolves, there is some, or more than a little bit of culpability when it comes to the character Mel Gibson plays in the person of Fletcher Christian. This story, The Mutiny of the Bounty, has been filmed 5 times. The first one as a silent film in 1916 in Australia. The second one, called In the Wake of the Bounty, starred Errol Flynn. This gave everybody a great idea. And so MGM filmed Mutiny on the Bounty with Clark Gable. This was highly critically acclaimed and also made a ton of money for them, which is probably the reason why we got the 1984 version. Same for 1962. It made decent money with Marlon Brando. But in 1984, they felt they had perhaps a new lease on life because they wanted to tell the real story, because all the other ones were, well, they fudged history a little bit, let's say. As for awards, Arthur Ibbetson received a nomination for Best Cinematography from the British Society of Cinematography. I suppose it was a thing in the 80s, but nobody remembers that now. Roger Donaldson was nominated for Best Director at Cannes. He didn't get it. However, as I said, its 1930s predecessor was showered with awards, and it did exceedingly well at the box office. But in this case, the 1984 version was virtually ignored by all award shows. And I think the end conclusion you should draw from trying to remake a classic is you can't remake a classic. The 1935 one is the Hollywood one, and the 1984 one, no matter how well it's made or no matter how historically accurate it is, nobody really wanted it. Now, as for historical accuracy, This one is considered the best depiction of events out of the 5 films. There were some deviations, there was some omission of crewmen for brevity, but most of the inaccuracy is everything that wasn't filmed was planned for the sequel. Of course, that sequel never came about because this movie never made any money, so there was no money to shoot a sequel. I think the biggest inaccuracy is the fact that only a small group of the crewmen actually mutinied, half of the midshipmen and some of the malcontents. Most of the crew was as surprised as Anthony Hopkins' character Bligh. There were only 18 men could fit in the little boat they picked to maroon them on some island. So most of the loyal crewmen actually remained aboard. And as a result, some of them were actually exonerated when the actual court-martial happened. This is not completely depicted, but of course, as I said, this was supposed to be a two-parter, so you can't really find fault with the producers and director of this movie because, well, they had higher intentions. As I said, the real main character of this film is Bligh, brilliantly played by Anthony Hopkins. He depicts a British officer with a severe chip on his shoulder. Lieutenant Bligh, as we come to know him, had been in the Navy since the age of 7, which was typical. Parents who wanted their child to have a officer Navy career would enroll their children young, usually, as in this case, as a captain's servant. So he would be on the roll as a captain's servant when those ships would usually just be in port. It would be a favor for a friend to put his child as your captain's servant, so he gets credits. Now, by the age of 15, Bligh was serving on a 15 gunboat. By the age of 23, he was a midshipman serving on a 32 gunboat. And in 1779, he was master for Captain Cook on his fateful last voyage. Cook was in fact clubbed to death by Hawaiians on shore, something Bligh blamed the officers and Marines for this specific incident, because he felt they were negligible. This is the reason why Lieutenant Bligh stayed Lieutenant Bligh for such a long time. He had a big mouth. He wouldn't shut up. He wouldn't shut up about the incident, and he had strong opinions on the subject, things that would embarrass people, and things like that just simply do not endear you to the Admiralty, and they decide whether or not you get a captaincy. So, of course, he didn't get one. Bligh's father-in-law, however, was a man known as Campbell, who owned a fleet of merchantmen, and Bligh would serve as captains of his ships from about 1783 to 1786, and he would sail to the West Indies. Ultimately, the Admiralty commissioned the Bounty for purposes of breadfruit. They had decided that breadfruit, which grows in Asia, would make for great fodder for the slaves held in the West Indies, and Campbell secured the Bounty for Bligh. Bligh, as a result, handpicked the crew. Most of them were people he had already worked with under Captain Cook. Amongst them was Fletcher Christian, who he had also sailed with several times on voyages to the West Indies. Fletcher was highly ambitious. From a lawyer family, he had forgone his training to go into merchant shipping and was looking to advance. And he had attached himself to Bligh. They had struck up a friendship, and so he was willing to serve without pay, something that pleased Bligh tremendously, because they were cutting costs at every opportunity. Now, the Bounty was originally a civilian vessel. It wasn't made to be a Navy ship. It was a cutter. As a result, the ship was severely overcrowded, not in the least because they had to store a lot of water, and on the return voyage, they would carry all the potted breadfruit that had been grown in Tahiti. So the ship's complement was 47 men, including Bligh, And they also had 2 civilian botanists to care for the breadfruit to be purchased from the Tahitians and replanted in the West Indian colonies in the hopes that the slaves would enjoy the food. More on this later. This obviously was a cost-cutting measure in hopes of making the West Indies more profitable. None of the West Indies were ever profitable. They were always a disaster, but they were always looking to make a second India a little closer to home. It didn't work out for France. It didn't work out for England. It didn't work out for Holland. It didn't work out for any of the, not even Spain and Portugal. It didn't work out for any of the sailing nations of that time. But that's all hindsight. It wasn't for lack of trying. To make space, and this is a fateful decision, the Navy also cut out the company of Marines typical on these ships. So Bligh was the only officer on board. And he had to rely on his midshipmen, and this is a big point, to maintain order and to make sure that the ship gets to its destination. Now, obviously, Bligh had no objections because he had watched Captain Cook getting killed, and he was very opinionated. He had his own ideas on how to run a ship, and we'll see during this voyage how that all comes about. Now, remember, these are about 50 men crammed on a very small ship on a very dangerous voyage. The idea was to round the Horn, which is the southern point of Chile. Cape Horn is not a happy place to sail, and as depicted in the movie, they tried this for a month and do not succeed, largely because they had left too late. The Admiralty had not given them clearance to leave. This is not entirely the Admiralty's fault. There was a war brimming. These were revolutionary times, and Britain was gearing up for war with France. So they couldn't spare ships, and they had to have priorities. So after a month of trying to round the Cape, they had to retrace their steps, and they took the route of Cape of Good Hope, which is rounding the point of South Africa, which is the long way. As a result, they finally did get to Tahiti, but that was after 10 months of really hard seas, some 28,000 miles, sea miles of sailing, on a little ship with a crew that was severely exhausted. Exhausted because Bligh had his own ideas on things. He had ideas on cleanliness. The ship had to be spotless, which is not very typical for Navy ships at that time. He wanted his men to exercise, which is an idea he got under Captain Cook. So he made them dance for hours every day. He had them on watch for 4 hours, and they would have 8 hours of downtime. But this downtime would partially be spent cleaning and dancing. It was a frugal voyage. So, because money was tight, food was tight. And food on ships is never very good to begin with, especially in the 18th century. And if you also curtail the meeting out of rum, you do not have a happy crew, but they suffered him well enough, mostly because I suspect most of them knew him, probably because they all felt that this voyage would be profitable. It was a high priority for the Navy. Sailors are in it for money, desperate men in search of desperate fortune. So they would have been on board, as they say. But then they got to Tahiti, and probably one of the most interesting scenes in the film is probably how it played out in reality. The locals were happy to see a foreign ship because that meant a lot of things. The Tahitians were very welcoming, to the point that the men on the ship, Tahiti was a paradise. The women were depicted accurately, topless. They had to put a watch on the ship because the men would trade anything that wasn't nailed down. And they would even pull the nails out of the ship because women like shiny things for sexual favors. The Tahitians love tattoos, as do all South Sea Island natives. And to be eligible to marry, you have to have ink. So most, if not all of the sailors, except for Bligh, ended up getting them. that is also depicted in the film accurately. There was a greater extent because Tahitian men would want their entire buttocks covered in black ink. So everybody got them, including our midshipman Fletcher Christian. Now, obviously, this affronted Lieutenant Bligh, Commander Bligh, Captain Bligh, who was the only one who didn't enjoy the party, but enjoy it they did. So finally, after 5 months, when the fruit trees have finally grown, they take them all with them, some 2015 of them, cramping the ship. The trees would make up over a third of uh, the ship, making the crew quarters even smaller. The crew did not take the return trip well. They did not take a return to the discipline they had to live under well. The bad food, no women, the brutal punishment. They weren't happy. Bligh wasn't happy. Christian was definitely not happy. At some point, they had to get water. They stopped at an island and sent out a watering party. Christian was sent out, and because Bligh was so fastidious not to create incidents with the natives, they were ordered to leave their muskets behind in the boat. As a result, the natives attacked. Christian had to run, and of course, Bligh berates him for it. We're at the point that Bligh is berating him for every little thing, because their friendship has worn down and has degraded to the point of enmity. Then there's the incident of the missing coconuts. Everybody would have a complement of coconuts to enjoy, and Bligh was missing some of his, and of course he blamed Christian. So again, Christian is openly humiliated, accused of theft, and the lawyer's son took that hard from someone he perceived as to be below his station. So in the year of 1789, the mutiny started on the very next watch. So ultimately, Bligh and 18 of his men parted ways with the mutiny. They filled the boat with rations and put as many people as would fit in it into the boat and set it adrift, expecting Bligh and his men to maroon on a nearby island. This, in fact, happened. They did make it to an island, only to be attacked by natives. They lost a man, and Bligh then decided, well, this is just not going to work. We'll just have to sail to civilization. This was an interesting voyage that took him weeks, and he sailed a shocking 4,000 miles, ultimately making it to the Dutch colony of Coupang. And he was ultimately repatriated back to Britain and court-martialed. On the trip back, he was sailing on a Dutch vessel. He complained bitterly of the sanitary conditions aboard the Dutch ship and the hygiene of the crew, which is fair because Dutch ships were famously disgusting. In a letter, he called them such nasty beasts. Well, his ship was, of course, spotless, but he didn't have it for very long. What Bligh did have was a serious problem with OCD and no filter, and, well, basically he was a dick. The planned sequence would have been the aftermath. Post-court-martial, Lieutenant Bligh was exonerated and celebrated for his heroic sailing trip of 4,000 miles, and he was promoted to captain. The Navy sent a ship called the Pandora under the infamous Captain Edwards to hunt down the bounty, whilst Bligh got a much bigger ship to repeat and finish his mission finally, which is provide breadfruit to the colonies. The slaves refused to eat it. So ultimately, this whole notion was a dismal failure. Bligh would then serve as captain during the Napoleonic Wars with distinction. The Pandora, meanwhile, shipwrecked on the Great Barrier Reef. They had recaptured about 11 of the mutineers. Shipwreck killed 4 of them. The remaining men were returned to England and court-martialed. Several of them were exonerated because Bligh had vouched for them, and they were only on board because they wouldn't fit into the boat. Bligh ultimately became an admiral. He was present for the slave revolt in the West Indies. Yes, another uprising. And then he was governor of the penal colony of New South Wales. Australia, where the locals rose up against him in the Rum Rebellion, and then he was forcibly deported. I suspect in both cases his personality did have something to do with the situation. He ultimately died in 1817 at the age of 64. His reputation by then was no longer intact because the brother of Fletcher Christian had made it his personal mission to take the behavior and actions of Lieutenant Bligh at the time to task. Fletcher Christian, however, who inherited the bounty, made it back to Tahiti, reunited with his wife, and parted ways with most of the mutineers because they really didn't like each other much. Several of the Tahitians went with them, and he ended up settling on Pitcairn Island with 11 of the mutineers and a bunch of the Tahitian men and their wives. And of course, then they quarreled to the point that they started murdering each other. There were drugs involved. Apparently, there was a leaf on the island, and everybody enjoyed it, but it made them somewhat paranoid. They did burn the bounty to avoid detection. As I said, they ended up arguing over women, whose women belonged to whom. Most of the mutineers were killed, including Fletcher Christian. He was shot, and there was only one survivor, and he lived out the remainder of his life on the island for 35 years. But the descendants of Christian Fletcher still live there. Now, the plot of the movie, not the real events, but the movie, The Bounty, come down to, well, bros before hoes. If Bligh in the movie had understood his friend a little better, he would have given him and perhaps some of his men a break. But this wasn't in Bligh's character. Bligh had some quirks, had some peculiarities, and the crew suffered them well enough on the way to Tahiti, but once they got there and got a taste of the good life, well, it was just inevitable that they were going to clash with Bligh. Sensing he had lost the respect of his men and, more importantly, control of them, and his mission was in danger, and therefore his future captaincy, he flew off the handle, and he became vindictive and resentful, and resorted to corporal punishment, flogging people, which he hadn't done on the way in. He flew into rages, and this is typical conduct for maybe a sailor, but not for a gentleman and not for a captain. So it actually undermined his authority even more. He had no Marines to back him up. He was basically, well, he was begging for a mutiny, really. And once social conventions start to break down and the thin line these kinds of societies have to differentiate from each other, especially in an age and an era where revolution was changing all that, well, it's not very strange that these men would behave that way. Let's just say Bligh was a bad judge of character and not much of a people person. In the film, once set adrift, his small crew of 18 men also rebel against him, but he handles that better. Probably, in reality, because these men were desperate. They were in a boat that would sink if they weren't bailing constantly. They had about a week's of food that they had to stretch, and stretch it they did for like 4 or 5, 6 weeks. They had no fresh water. They lived off whatever flew into the sails. Therefore, they didn't live. They basically became weaker and weaker. Those conditions aren't very conducive to rebellion. And then there's also the fact that in situations where you recognize that you're about to die, unless the people with the skills, they do have some authority left. And that's one thing Bligh had. He knew the Pacific well. He knew how to sail. He got them to a port. That he was really lucky doing so is another thing. Because let's face it, one tropical storm and that little boat, it would have all been over. And then this wouldn't have been a textbook mutiny case. He would have not have been court-martialed. He would have not have been exonerated. He would have been a footnote in history and not a big part of the story of the British Navy and the British Empire as a whole. Mutinies are a big thing. They really are. For example, in 1797, the Hermione mutinied because of the draconian punishments meted out on board. Um, Punishments during that time were brutal. Flogging would sometimes cause death. You would be at the mercy of the captain. So were these men in the Hermione. Um, as I said, these were revolutionary times. The lower classes were rising up against the gentry. So, for this reason alone, the British system became even more repressive. So, in this particular mutiny, 10 officers were murdered, including the captain, commandeered the ship and sailed it to Venezuela, turned it over to Spain in exchange for asylum. Mutinies can shape politics. That's the reality. There's the famous Kiel Mutiny, which basically sparked the German Revolution in World War One. Arguably, it ended the World War One because Germany was no longer ruled by Ludendorff and his other generals. It came under a civilian government, and all they cared about was ending the war as quickly as possible, uh, arguably leading up to World War Two. Then there's the mutiny on the Potemkin in 1905, which destabilized Tsar's Russia because even though the mutiny started out over, I think it was the crew having to forcibly eat rotten food, and I mean really rotting food. Once they commandeered the ship, the rest of the Russian Navy was sympathetic enough that their crews wouldn't fire on the Potemkin. Then you have a big problem. Then there's the famous Columbia Eagle in 1970. In a protest against the Vietnam War, two merchant marines seized the supply ship. It was filled with napalm. They forced the crew to sail it to Cambodia. Different times. Crews are usually superstitious at best. They don't like their lives risked unnecessarily. Um, and when it's a life or death situation and you're looking at the possibility of drowning, you tend to lose trust in leadership. And those are usually signs of a system that just doesn't work. And then, of course, there was the fate of Henry Hudson, who in 1610 was looking for the Northwest Passage to India, and he got stuck in ice. The crew mutinied, and they left Hudson and a small company marooned, and Hudson was never seen again. The mutineers, well, they didn't fare any better. Typically, mutineers are usually punished for their deeds. Their freedom is only a desperate one. Those mutineers died from disease or they were killed by natives. And there you have it. The Bounty, a name that has some serious historical reference. A movie that didn't work. And arguably, you could say that it didn't work not because it wasn't well made, because it certainly is. This movie is gorgeous. It's well shot. It's well acted. It was a big budget affair. It had a good script. You can't find fault with the story. It looks fantastic. It even has boobs. Why didn't it work? Why didn't nobody go? Why did they go to the mission? Who knows? Well, I could venture a guess. They had thought of it as a miniseries in the late 70s. Those were typical of the era. The most famous one, in my opinion, is Shaka Zulu. They really lend themselves to telling a longer story. In the 70s and 80s, it was atypical for a movie to be 4 hours. There was no Lord of the Rings before that. Sure, there were movies that were long. Um, they generally weren't that successful, but it could have worked. A 4 hour movie, even back then, as a double feature, if the two sides of the story are distinct enough, so people can have a movie break and get a beer or something to drink or some popcorn with a 15-minute intermission. However, they decided probably because of the whole budgetary thing, we're going to make two movies and we'll start with the first one. And once that's success, we'll try another one. However, much like the Pandora, the bounty was going to be, the movie at least, was going to be shipwrecked and would not see the sequel that it, in my opinion, deserves. Did Mel Gibson do a good job? I don't think so. I think he was average in the role. He came to it late. I don't think he was very committed to the project. I think he's right that they should have vilified him more instead of turn him into the young romantic hero suffering under a mentally afflicted captain, straining their friendship to the point that he has to betray him. They should have tried to make a different movie, but they didn't. In the end, you're bound by your script, you're bound by your concept, and this concept was based on something from 1935, based on a book on events from the 1800s. This was the fifth attempt. It's historically the best attempt, and let's hope it'll be the last. And with that, I leave you for this time. Bye for now.